Hello, everybody. You are very welcome to this webinar to launch a new report from NexSys, or Next Generation Energy Systems, to give the strategic research program its full title. This report is the first, hopefully, of many. It is a road mapping document that focuses on the impact of different electrical systems on Ireland's decarbonisation goals. It's an important synthesis because even though we have several climate policies and roadmaps that focus on reducing emissions, in Ireland, we really still have a way to go to meet the targets because our emissions are still projected to exceed the ceilings that have been set. My name is Claire O'Connell, and I'm delighted to be the moderator for this session, where we will hear from experts at the UCD Energy Institute and NexSys about this roadmap and how modelling and research is helping us to understand what we need in Ireland as we barrel towards 2030, which is, of course, a focus year for many climate-related targets and a big stepping stone towards meeting 2050 targets. We will be hearing from our esteemed panel, so I'm going to introduce them briefly now. We have Associate Professor Terence O'Donnell, who is an Associate Professor at the School of Electrical and Electronic Engineering in UCD. We've Dr. Conor Sweeney, who is an Assistant Professor at UCD School of Maths and Statistics. We've Dr. Charlene Vance, who is an early career researcher, a postdoc at this Chemical and Energy Recycling Lab at the School of Chemical and Bioprocess Engineering in UCD. And we've Professor Lisa Ryan, who is Professor in Energy Economics at UCD's School of Economics. So you're all very welcome. Thanks for joining us today. First up, I would like to invite Terence to introduce us to the roadmap. So Terence, please tell us what it's all about.
Okay, thank you, Claire. I guess maybe before introducing the roadmap, I'll just say a few words about the NexSys program and what the NexSys program actually is. So the NexSys program is a research program funded by or co-funded by Research Ireland, industry, and a philanthropic donation. It's a collaboration between a number of universities and research institutes in Ireland and industry. It's the diagram you see on the screen there on the left. The diagram sort of gives an overall picture of the areas involved that we're sort of researching. So we're looking at, we have research in looking at transport and the use of energy in transport. The sort of the nexus be water energy nexus, so how energy and water are related. We have research in that. We have research looking at offshore wind and in the use of energy in sort of cities and communities. And in the center of that diagram, you see the energy system. And so that's sort of one of the largest strands in the energy system, is energy systems and looking at energy systems. And I guess within that, we have a number of, I suppose, deep dives, academics doing sort of deep dives into various parts of the energy system. So we have, academics looking at the power system. So that's the electrical grid, how it could be operated, the dynamics of it. So the dynamics refer to how it reacts to changes. And then also looking at sort of the lower voltage grids that feed at the devices connected to it that connect up to homes and businesses in the country. And then we have, academics doing a deep dive into weather and how weather impacts on, say, renewable generation in particular. We have people looking at the gas networks, the use of hydrogen perhaps in the gas network, and the use of hydrogen in general in the energy system. And then we have people looking at the sort of social and economic implications of the energy transition. And I guess the road mapping activity is really about trying to take all of that expertise together and try to figure out, what are likely pathways, or try to identify pathways towards the decarbonized energy system, or what's we refer to as the net zero energy system, which we're aiming to have by 2050. So that's the general idea of the NexSys program and the roadmap. And I guess, since it's a roadmap, then we should really kind of know where we want to go. And so it's kind of interesting to perhaps look at what is a net zero system, or what are the sort of elements that might, be composed of a net zero system. So you know, if we divide the energy use that we have in the system into, say, 4 areas: electricity, transport, buildings, industry. If we want to get to a net zero system in transport, we probably have to, move away a lot from the reliance on, say, petrol and diesel in vehicles, and much more towards electrification. Maybe not just direct electrification through electric vehicles, but there's also a role perhaps there for use of green fuels. In buildings, similarly, we have to move away from the use of fossil fuels from heating in buildings, and move towards sort of electrification of that heating. And also things like, upgrading buildings, and perhaps the increased use of technology such as district heating, which we really don't have much of in this country at the moment. In industry, it's the same sort of a picture, moving much more towards the use of electricity for the energy needs in industry also. All of that means basically that the electricity system becomes a much larger part of our energy system in the end. So today, for example, our electricity serves perhaps around 22% of the end energy use across all sectors. In a net zero energy system, that will probably increase up to 70 to 80%. And then, of course, the idea is that we try to generate all of that electricity from renewable sources, so that it is coming from sort of clean, carbon-free sources. And all of that, I guess, means that in the future, in this sort of net zero carbon energy system, there's going to be the electricity system is sort of a much larger part of it. And I guess what we're trying to do with the roadmap is we're trying to sort of answer questions like, well, how would that system operate? What's the sort of technologies that we would like in that system in order to operate it successfully in a net zero carbon manner? That's it in a nutshell, I guess.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that overview, Terence. And it's a very meaty document. It brings together a lot of different strands of research. So I'd like to ask our panelists about to dive a little deeper into their own areas of research and how that is feeding into our understanding of that roadmap. So Conor, you have a particular interest in wind energy. So could I ask you to tell us a little bit about the research that's feeding into the roadmap there?
Certainly. Thanks very much. So, yeah, it's great to be involved in this research for somebody who's got a background in meteorology or weather and climate as I do, because it really lets you talk to a lot of people from a lot of different disciplines, like electrical engineering and chemistry, and to bring it all together. It's very exciting, this future that we're facing, that will rely so heavily on renewable energies to generate our clean electricity. And in the case of Ireland, an awful lot of that is going to be provided by wind. We're going to see a lot more PV as well, where we generate electricity from sunlight. A lot of you would be familiar with these panels popping up on the roofs of houses all over the place, but we're going to see more utility scale PV as well. And they're probably going to be the backbone of our future RES, or I say RES for renewable energy sources for electricity. So what I've done in the research that I've been working on in collaboration with others here has been to try and figure out what will the future look like if we're relying so much essentially on the weather for our electricity, because wind is part of the weather and sunlight is part of the weather, and so are clouds. And so it's been really interesting for us to build a model that can inform us about this. We've done this by doing what nowadays is called a digital twin. So we've created a virtual Ireland that has a wind farm everywhere where we actually have a wind farm. It's got PV, or at least utility scale PV, everywhere where we have it. And we've run this using the weather that's actually happening, which we get from places like Met Éireann and the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting. And by doing this digital twin, we can compare it to what we're actually seeing. We're collaborating with EirGrid, which is fantastic because they give us really good data on wind and PV that has been generated. And by comparing our digital twin to the real world, we can be pretty confident that the model that we have is representing the real world. Now, when we've done that, it gets really exciting from a modeling point of view, because now I've got a model, and so long as I have more weather data, I can run the model for a longer period of time. So what we've done is we've taken the last 84 years of weather data, and we've driven that weather through our digital twin for Ireland and seeing how does wind compare for all of those years, every hour for 84 years, and the same for PV. And that's allowed us look at some quite interesting questions and provide answers to people. So what I've got here on the slide, the first one with the funny triangles and circles, the circles are all the wind farms in Ireland, both the ones we have now and the ones we're planning for the future for 2030. So you'll see there's some circles in the sea, they're the offshore wind that we're planning. And then the triangles are the PV, or the generating electricity from sunlight. And our model includes all of these, which allows us to compare the res infrastructure we have now, which is really largely wind, and see how that'll change in the future when we're putting more offshore and PV into the system. So below the little map of Ireland, you'll see that we have a current and future plot. So this is the generation that we get from renewables at the moment and what it'll look like in the future. And we're looking at periods when the generation is very low. So this is a real concern to utilities, but also to everyone that I talk to about renewable energy. They're kind of going, well, if we're really relying on wind and sun, what's going to happen to days like today? So I'm looking at my window and it's cloudy and it's not particularly windy. So that means you're not going to get much electricity from wind energy and you're not going to get much from PV. So obviously people like EirGrid and ESB and the government are going to want to know the worst case scenarios. So how long do we have these drought scenarios where the energy generated from renewables is very low? And by running our models, we're able to say, well, in the future plans, by putting more offshore wind and more PV into the system, we're going to really reduce the amount of droughts that we have compared to now. So that's the future plot at the bottom of this slide, is showing that in the summer, we'd have quite a lot of res droughts, low energy. That's because, as you know yourself, it's windier in the winter, right? So in the summer, it's less windy. So we'll have periods where the wind is quite low. In the future, because we'll have more PV and more offshore wind, those droughts will come down. On the right is a slightly different result we've seen, which is also really interesting. So the top left one of this, the one that has current and the kind of red dots going up, and beside that, we've got the future and the red dots. What I want to try and explain here is that the worst case scenario is every 1 year, if you go up the x-axis in the return period where it has 1y, and you go to the red dot, you'll see that every 1 year we'd expect a low energy to last for 6 days. So we'd have 6 days in a row when wind and PV aren't really giving us an awful lot. And again, what's interesting for us is that if you add in the future plans, the offshore and the PV, those droughts become shorter. So instead of being a 6-day drought every year, we'd expect it to be a 4-day drought every year. And that's really important to help us plan the type of capacity we need for the future grid, to make sure that we can put in, sorry, my timer's going, to make sure that we can put in reserve capacity, be it battery or storage, to take account of these future low return energy, renewable energy systems. I'll stop there. Thanks very much, Claire.
Thanks, Conor. That's fascinating. I mean, you know, the thought of 84 years, an hour for each of those 84, that's a massive amount of data, but it's very reassuring that the on-the-ground measurements, they're literally ground truth, the digital twin as well. So that increases your confidence in these projections as well. Brilliant, brilliant work. Thank you. Charlene, maybe I could ask you to speak to us a little bit about the potential role of green hydrogen within the energy system, because that's something you've been working on.
Yes, absolutely. So first, I just wanted to mention that within our group, we are looking at the role of hydrogen in the Irish energy system now and in the future. And in particular, I'm looking at the role of green hydrogen. So it's great to go right after Conor, who just introduced some of the challenges with renewable energy, being primarily that it's very variable. So at some points, there's very little generation, and at other points, there's actually too much generation. So the actual demand for electricity may be less than the amount of renewable energy that's being generated on the island of Ireland. And in this case, hydrogen is a great way to utilize that excess energy. So we can produce hydrogen through a process called electrolysis, where electricity is used to split water into oxygen and hydrogen. And then there are a few different technologies in terms of electrolyzers, which can be used to do this, with the main commercial technologies being alkaline or proton exchange membrane. then comes the tricky part, which is trying to understand how this hydrogen will be used. So one way that it could be used is to basically fill in the demand for electricity when renewable energy supplies are low. And in this way, hydrogen kind of acts like a battery. So it's a form of energy storage where we will produce the hydrogen when there's a lot of renewable energy supply, and we will then use that hydrogen to produce electricity when the renewable energy supply is low. But that's not the only way that hydrogen can be used. It can also be used in the heat sector, and it can also be used to cover transport demand. And here there's also various technologies that can be used. And if we want to complicate things even further, we can not only use hydrogen directly within heat and transport, but we can also convert hydrogen into other chemicals such as ammonia or into e-fuels. And this is particularly interesting for the transport sector in terms of methods that currently would be difficult to electrify, such as aviation. So this is just giving an overview of green hydrogen and how it can be used. Of course, there is a lot of challenges, primarily when we talk about variability. It's understanding what supply and what demand is available at what time, and how we want to utilize hydrogen, whether we are focusing more on using it for covering electricity demand, or whether we want to focus on using the hydrogen to cover heat or transport demand. This is all things that we are looking into within our research.
Great, thank you, Charlene. And can I just ask you to clarify, green hydrogen as opposed to any other color of hydrogen, that's the key, isn't it?
Yes, sorry, I should have mentioned. So green hydrogen specifically is hydrogen which is produced from renewable energy. So hydrogen can also be produced
to the very significant expansion of renewable generation.
Sorry, I don't know what that's going on there. Sorry about that.
I think AI is trying to answer for me. Yes, but
I'm sorry, folks, my sound has just gone for 1 second. I'm going to have to wait a second now. Sorry about this. Okay, should be okay now. Sorry, yeah, back in the game, I think. Okay.
Yeah. So hydrogen can also be produced from fossil fuels, or it can be produced from other sources of energy. But particularly, of course, in Ireland, with the rise of renewable energy sources, we are very much focused on green hydrogen.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Thanks for clarifying that. Lisa, I might move to you and ask you a little bit about the uptake of zero emissions technologies, because obviously it's wonderful having all these technologies, but people have to buy into them, don't they?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Claire. We're also very happy to be part of this project, and there's a group of us working in this area now. I mean, if we think about a strategy to decarbonize the energy system, the key parts are decarbonizing electricity and then the electrification of other sectors like heat and transport. And that, of course, assumes that people are going to switch their heating and driving and everything else to electricity. And also there's a significant amount of microgeneration going on, which, you know, I suppose some people, you have to see how that fits as well in the overall system. So we're looking at the uptake of zero emissions technologies, as we call them ZETs, just for short. And it's really about heat pumps, electric vehicles, and solar PV by households. And so here I'm going to show you just a little bit of some recent work we did on solar PV. So I'm sorry I didn't, it's all animated, so I'm afraid, Anthea, I'm going to have to ask you to click through it first. So I was going to describe really just how we do this work. So the first thing we do, we're trying to understand how households take up these different technologies. And if you look at a lot of the academic literature, a lot of assumptions are made, both, you know, in engineering models where it's assumed that a certain percentage of the population are going to take them up. And also in the academic sort of social science literature, where a lot of parameters are assumed around different types of households. So we carry out a survey in Ireland, to a nationally representative survey, a nationally representative sample of people, to try and account for that heterogeneity or differences between households, because there are large differences in terms of demographics, income levels, behavioral characteristics, the environmental attitude, and then of course physical household characteristics as well. And these will all determine whether a household is likely to take up a particular technology. So you can click on there. And once we carry out a survey, so we had 1,200 people in the survey. We've just carried out a second round of this survey to see how people's preferences are changing over time. We then develop a model based on these parameters. So we have a lot of questions in there on whether people are risk takers, then physical questions on their household size, the type of building they live in, and whether they have any particular technologies already. And then we have a willingness to pay calculation based on what their current electricity bill is and what they would be willing to pay for particular technologies. And we do that part with a discrete choice experiment. And from all of that analysis, we are then able to develop a model, which is a simulation that I should say my colleague Joe Wheatley has put together, this one here, where we can forecast out into the future on a decision choice model, based on a certain type of household, whether they are likely to take up the particular technology. And aggregating all those households together will then give us a share of the population that is likely to undertake it in particular regions and particular settings across the whole country. Next bit. And so from that, then we can model different policy scenarios. So our objective is really to work out, firstly, how to understand how households take up these different technologies. But once we have that model set up, which is an agent-based model, then we want to model different incentives, different policies, and whether they are going to be successful in taking up households. So here we've modeled solar PV. And I think it's very interesting because a lot of the time we think about solar PV in isolation. How much electricity is it going to generate from all these rooftops? Increasingly, we see that households have also installed batteries. And so there aren't too many studies around that are looking at what is the impact of batteries being installed with a solar PV. Often the policies are just designed to install a solar PV and to give a price if you feed it back to the grid, but there's very little understanding of what the impact of a battery is. So here you can see when we model 4 different scenarios, the different scenarios reflect different costs of the technology, both of the battery and of the solar PV, and also then the price that they are paying for electricity from the grid, and then the price that they get as a feed-in tariff back into the grid. And the 4 different scenarios will then show you SAR is the attachment rate. In other words, how many of these solar PV systems are likely to have a battery associated with them? And if they do, how will that change? If you look at the last 2 columns, the self-consumption, the percentage of that solar PV that can be consumed within the household. I haven't defined the different scenarios here, but D is the most expensive scenario in that it's high cost for the technology, you're paying a higher electricity bill normally, and you're also getting a higher feed-in tariff. And if you look at that scenario, you can see that there's only 17% of people that are likely to install a battery, whereas our base scenario where batteries are cheaper, and even though you get still a lower price getting back in, selling back to the grid, you've got nearly 61% installing a battery. Next click. And from that, then from these individual households and the policy impacts, we can then look at collectively over the system, what does this do to our overall system? And so if you look at scenario D, which is our high cost scenario, we're looking at the amount of solar generation in the top layer between the base and the D. And you can see that there's more generation happening in the scenario D. However, the amount that's being imported from the grid, which is the middle layer, that's percentage here is imported from the grid. You can see that it's because people have fewer batteries in scenario D, they're much more likely to have to import from the grid at peak times, compared with on the right, the base scenario where more people have batteries, where they have it spread out. And then finally, you can see this, how they're storing it over time, that on the right-hand bottom corner, you can see that households are much more likely to be able to store electricity if they have a battery. So I've just given you a whirlwind. I'm sorry it's been so short, but the idea is really to understand a little bit how households uptake the technology, what the impact of policy is on that uptake, and then translate that through to grid and onto Terence's research, I suppose, and how that'll impact on the overall electricity system.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lisa. I'm here, like, I'm learning all these new terms, ZETs and RESs and everything. The language is very cool. So I suppose we've been hearing a bit about the generation of electricity and the demand. Terence, maybe you could speak to us a little bit about how to balance those two sides. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So okay, so I guess, you know, the challenge of a system, if we move towards a system that is much more reliant on electricity, and that electricity is much more reliant on weather for its generation, and of course, as we all know, weather is quite variable, so we end up with a generation that is very variable. But of course, the way the electricity system works is that at every moment in time, we have to be able to balance the demand with the supply. So we have to be able to balance how much is being generated with how much is actually required at that point in time. And that raises a lot of challenges, you know, once you sort of have the weather dependent generation. So there are several solutions to that. And I guess one approach to it is to try to put more flexibility into the demand side. So in other words, to change the pattern of demand so that maybe we can increase the demand or move the demand to times when there's high renewables and move it away from times when there is less renewables. There's sort of increased opportunities to do that, especially if you electrify heating and transport, because, you know, there's some degree of flexibility in terms of when people can actually charge their EV batteries. So you can move that sort of around a little bit. There's also a degree of flexibility in how you can use heating in houses, because you can sort of move, you know, you can move that around a little bit also. So that's the idea of I guess, trying to make the demand side more flexible. That's one way to approach it. Another way is to try to put more storage into the system. So we already have battery storage in the system, and batteries are quite good at storing energy over sort of shorter durations of time. So maybe for, you know, maybe storing energy that could be used some hours later, and maybe just storing enough energy to use for perhaps an hour or 2 hours. But if you think about sort of balancing that supply and demand over long periods of time, and Conor referred earlier to the, you know, the fact that you will have periods of sort of low renewable generation, then you also need to consider balancing it, perhaps storing energy and from, say, you know, for time durations of weeks or months or seasons. And then, of course, those other storage technologies, which are referred to as long duration storage technologies, are important in that context. And I mean, Charlene referred to sort of, you know, the use of green hydrogen earlier as a possible means to do long duration storage. So that's important. But there are other technologies also that could potentially be used to store energy over longer periods of time. Mm-hmm. But I guess another aspect of it, however, that maybe sometimes gets less attention is the challenges of balancing the system over very, very short periods of time. This is kind of what's referred to as kind of the dynamics of the system. So typically, you know, the electricity system is set up in a manner that it has to be robust against, you know, faults. We refer to them as faults that occur in the system. So things like generators might, you know, a generator might have an outage at a certain time, or you know, maybe we get during a storm, you get a power line going down. So you get these faults, you know, happening in the system, and so a system has to be robust and sort of stand up to those sort of things. And at the moment, we have these large conventional fossil fuel generators in our system, and those are sort of big chunks of spinning metal. And that's good, because actually what they have built into them is this thing called inertia. It's not easy to sort of slow them down. And so that's kind of when some sort of fault occurs in the system, they buy you some time in order to correct the system, or to find some solution to the fault that occurred in the system. So they typically buy you time of several seconds in order to correct for the fault or the effects of the fault in the system. However, if we want to go to a 100% renewable system, then essentially what we're sort of suggesting is all of those large fossil fuel generators have to leave the system. Then we have to rely on renewable generation, which is a very, very different way of reacting to faults. And basically, it has to be controlled in a certain manner to do certain things. So there are quite a number of challenges around that. And then there are technological solutions like new technologies, such as things like what are referred to as grid forming converters or synchronous condensers that can be used to do that. But that operation of an electrical power system reliant totally on 100% renewable generation from wind or solar has never actually been done in practice. So that's a major research challenge to figure out how to do that.
Great, thanks, Terence. And now, if anybody does have questions from the audience, please put them in the Q&A tab. We already have one there, so please add them. But I have a few questions for our panelists. Lisa, Terence mentioned flexibility there as a major factor. Do you think we will have sufficient flexibility by 2030 for 80% renewable electricity provided by demand management from EVs, heat pumps, and solar PV batteries and batteries?
Sorry.
No, you're grand.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. I don't think we will have sufficient flexibility from the demand side, from the management of the demand side. I think we're getting better at it, or we have few steps to go to even to get far enough, because a lot of those technologies that are being installed don't always have smart controls coming with them, and we do risk, as we put in more and more people do buy EVs, that they could actually have the opposite effect, and people come home from work and then plug in their EVs at 6 o'clock at night, which is exactly what we don't want. So I think there'll be a number of things we'll need. First, I mean, in some countries like in Denmark, if you buy an EV, it comes with a smart control. You're not actually physically able to charge it during peak time unless you're willing to pay a premium to do so. In Ireland, I mean, obviously we have time of use tariffs that are coming in, and people with smart meters are signing up for them to a certain extent. I would say they haven't been very flexible so far. They haven't been particularly attractive for consumers, so lots of people have not signed up for them. But I think when they become more routine, people will just get used to, if they have these technologies, to plugging them in at night. But the roadmap shows overall, like by 2030, gas turbines will still be providing most flexibility actually in the overall system. So if we don't have enough wind, they'll be put on for short periods of time. So gas is still going to be in the system as a backup or source of flexibility. And the other thing is storage is increasingly important. But it depends on what kind of duration that we're talking about, how much flexibility we need. As Terence and Conor already referenced, you could have a period of 2 weeks, and so far we don't really have a solution to that in terms of storage. Or even demand management. I mean, maybe if all the data centers turned off, but that's an unlikely thing. But there are definitely some sources of demand in the system, for example, data centers, other heavy energy users, as well as then households. So it'll be a mixture of all these different technologies and harnessing them together. And I would say that the electricity market isn't there yet at all in providing the right incentives for people to do that yet. As well as we need to do take some regulatory steps to provide those things, as well as accepting maybe that there will have to be a little bit of gas in the system to be able to provide some large scale flexibility.
Usually gas in the system, and I mean it sounds like there's a public awareness piece there as well, that people just need to sort of get into those habits of plugging things in at the times where it works best for the system. Is there a piece to be done there?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard some ads recently, look out the window. Is it a windy day? Turn on your washing machine if it is. But I do think there's a lot more that could be done. And I know in some countries they've had, for decades, they've had cheaper energy prices at night, electricity prices at nighttime. And I think that's something that hasn't it isn't pervasive in Ireland, and you do hear people talking, is it safe, you know, to turn things on at night time? So I think there's quite a lot of communication that could be done around that, as well as there being
campaign years
significant
ago about
incentives.
the night rate. That seems to have gone. Conor, you were smiling there at looking out the window at the windy day. Can I ask you about I mean, Ireland, we're an island. How important is our interconnectedness with European sources for keeping that consistency going?
Yeah, that's thanks, Claire. That's a really interesting question. The fact that we're an island makes our research even more interesting to the world at large, I think. It's very difficult for us to do things that would be a lot easier in European countries. So if we put in renewable energy and we have too little or too much, we're limited in how we can move that around the grid, as opposed to other countries that are on continental Europe and they're very much connected to their neighbours. However, we do have interconnectors, which are lines that connect Ireland to the UK, and there's one going to France, and there's a few more planned in the future. So one of the things we're interested in is how much we can use those interconnectors to try and overcome some of these problems. Because from the weather point of view, as we all know, as we leave Ireland in the dark months to go to warmer and sunnier climes, the weather isn't the same everywhere, right? And Europe's reasonably large on a weather scale. So the weather that we have in the northwest of Europe is not necessarily the weather we have over the Mediterranean. And because we have all this great weather data that we can use in our research, we can look at the weather over all of Europe. And so identify when wind and PV are really bad in Ireland, is it possible that actually the wind and PV are really good somewhere else? So the wind's good in northeastern Europe, the PV is good in southern Europe, and therefore by swapping electricity over these interconnectors, is that a way that we can overcome some of the issues that are well known with these periods of low renewable energy? So that's one exciting area we're looking at. As with a lot of the other ones, it's somewhat limited. We can't rely completely on the interconnectors, but I think it's another part of the puzzle that'll help us get closer to this net zero decarbonisation of our energy system.
Great. So instead of looking out the window, we're literally looking out the window to Europe to see.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's a big window.
What's their weather doing? How can we plug into that? Very good. Charlene, you were telling us about green hydrogen and the importance there. I mean, what do you see as the main drivers and barriers kind of, that are around the development of that market for green hydrogen? Because it does seem like a relative, well, hydrogen has obviously been around forever. Its use as a renewable just seemed to be one of the newer kids on the block, certainly for Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in terms of drivers, as I mentioned before, green hydrogen is produced from renewables. So if we don't have the renewable capacity to cover the electricity demand that already exists, we're not going to be able to produce green hydrogen because we'll need even more to cover that market. That being said, of course, some of the demand for green hydrogen would then feed back into the electricity grid, because if we're using it as a form of storage, then that's more so balancing out those issues. But particularly when we talk about meeting the demands for heat and transport, that's where we know, just based on the current, I mean, actually currently, I think the majority of the energy demand in Ireland is going to heat and transport, not to electricity. So although there is a growing electricity demand, particularly as electricity is being used more for heat and transport, there are still going to be some areas where we won't be able to electrify. As I mentioned, particularly in terms of transport, we might actually really need green hydrogen in those areas. So yeah, first most important thing is whether or not we have the renewable energy capacity to produce this green hydrogen. And then comes all of the barriers with the actual technology in terms of hydrogen technologies. So as you mentioned, hydrogen technologies, although they have been kind of researched for a very long time, their commercialization is still, not quite there. And one of the main issues, of course, is cost. So it's currently cheaper to produce hydrogen from fossil fuels than it is from electricity or from renewable electricity. that being said, if we had some sort of supports in place in order to incentivize the production of green hydrogen, primarily because it is a carbon-free source of energy, then the economics could look better and people might actually start to invest. But yeah, there's still quite a bit of policy gaps in that way. And then also in terms of technology uptake, as Lisa mentioned, we really need to consider the human element. So whether or not people will be interested in buying, for example, a fuel cell electric vehicle, which is a hydrogen, an electric vehicle using hydrogen. Will people be interested in that? Would they be interested in heating with hydrogen gas, or would they prefer to use electricity for heating? And this is a very complicated question because, you know, there's the residential side, but there's also the industrial side and the commercial side, and all of these different consumers have different needs.
Yeah.
So yeah,
the complex picture. It's very much an emerging one. Thank you. Before we go to the audience questions, Terence, I did want to ask you about the important areas that the road mapping will be focusing on in the next year, just to round out this session of the webinar.
Yeah, sure, Claire. Yeah. I mean, like, I guess we've touched on a lot of the important areas already in our discussions so far, but maybe just to sort of summarize some of them. I mean, you know, I guess, okay, so we have, you know, we have lots of sort of targets and policies in place for what we should have by 2030 in the system. Now, you can argue whether those will be actually met or not, but at least, you know, there's sort of a reasonable amount of consensus on what exactly, you know, on what the targets for 2030 are. However, as we go beyond 2030 to 2050 and the net zero system, there's a massive leap there to go from, you know, the interim targets of 2030 towards 2050. So, and there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that. So there's a lot of uncertainties around, you know, the mix of technologies that's appropriate, the sort of the characteristics of those technologies, the projections for costs associated with those technologies. So we're going to be trying to work on understanding how technologies evolve, how the you know, the important technologies might evolve going forward beyond sort of 2030. Sorry. And of course, the technologies we're talking about are sort of really important areas is storage, storing electricity and maximizing the use of our renewables. And we've already talked about long duration storage. And, you know, so we want to sort of, we're going to be doing some sort of work on, you know, trying to define, well, what are the technologies? What exactly are the quantities of long duration storage that we might need? So taking into account the kind of work that Conor is doing on sort of worst case weather scenarios, how much do we actually need to store in order to get us through periods like that? That's going to be an interesting piece of work. On system flexibility, you know, Lisa earlier referred to the fact that, well, it doesn't look like we would have enough flexibility really in the system to deal with balancing all of the balancing issues of supply and demand in 2030. But there are other technologies coming into play, which are interesting. So, you know, there's technologies like vehicle to grid, which are being talked about. And this is the idea that, you know, you could use the battery in your electric vehicle, not just to sort of get you from A to B, but actually when you take it home and plug it in, you could use the energy that's stored in that battery to perhaps, you know, use that in your house, maybe to sort of reduce your energy bills. That's especially interesting if there are time variable electricity prices. But you could also use it to help out the grid. So you could also deliver that energy from your car battery back to the grid at times, perhaps of low renewables, or you know, or perhaps to sort of reduce emissions overall. So new technologies like that are coming around are really interesting to look at. And so we'll be looking at sort of, you know, the impact of those sorts of technologies also in the system, and their role in sort of moving towards net zero. Then you have sort of the important area of offshore wind, because expansion of offshore wind is seen as sort of one of the sort of main ways in which we're going to expand our renewable generation in the future. And there are some, you know, I suppose very large targets for expansion of offshore wind. I mean, the thing about Ireland is it has a great wind resource. And so there's a resource there that could really be captured and put to use. However, in reality, the resource is probably far in excess of what the country could actually use simply in terms of electricity demand. And so there's really interesting questions there around, well, if you really want to develop that offshore wind resource, you know, how would you do that? That links to, you know, conversion into green hydrogen, perhaps, that Charlene talked about. It also links into further interconnection, so you could export that to the rest of Europe if we have increased interconnection, as Conor talked about earlier. So again, those are really interesting sort of questions around how, you know, how much of those things should we have in the system, and how would it help with making our system net zero? And of course, the final thing is the whole interesting interplay between direct electrification of things like transport. So in other words, what I mean by that is directly using battery electric vehicles versus perhaps converting electricity into renewable or green fuels and using that instead. And so there's an interplay between those two things. And, you know, that's kind of an interesting area also that we will be focusing on in the next year.
Absolutely. Great, thanks for that look forward. We have a load of questions. We have a heap of questions here in the Q&A tab. I'm just going to go through them in order. So if any of our panelists would like to answer, I'm just going to throw on the glasses for this one. So when we appear to be seeing a big uptake in solar PV by households and a stalling of adoption of heat pumps in retrofit at a very low level. Any views on this and what might work to promote heat electrification? Any of our panel members got thoughts on that one? Lisa? Oh, just turn on the microphone.
Sorry there. Yeah. I think heat pumps are really crucial in the overall scheme of things. I think that, like, we know that heat is in Ireland, like, we have one of the highest shares of solid fuel and oil fueled heating systems in the residential sector across all of Europe. So, and it's partly to do with because people are off the gas grid a lot of the time outside of urban areas. They tend to have oil tanks. So I think in terms of electrification of heat, we should be targeting those houses and maybe, you know, providing a differential rate to houses that have oil boilers and getting them onto heat pumps first. And right now there's no differentiation at all. So you might have a very efficient gas boiler and, you know, might be causing too much emissions compared to somebody, you know, with a large house that's poorly insulated, an oil boiler. And the other thing is that I don't know, I think we would like to carry out some more analysis on the way the grants are provided. You have to, you know, show that you're retrofitting your house up to B2 level to be eligible to get a heat pump. We're starting to look at whether this might make more sense to be more flexible on this point and, you know, get people electrified with heat pumps and maybe get them insulating bit by bit, because overall the package is so expensive right now. If you're doing the big retrofit plus the heat pump, I think it is quite difficult. Even though there are now cheaper loans available, we're still talking 50,000 euros, and I think that's off-putting for people to take on that level of debt. So I think that's something that we'd like to examine a bit further.
Right, so widening the net so more people can start to do this maybe at a different pace, but still get to the end point. Okay, very good. Thanks for that. Another question: from a cost perspective to the consumer, what design life is being assumed for domestic battery and indeed inverter per household? It's likely that domestic systems will need to replace one or the other within the design life period of the PV panels, about 25 years.
I can just take that briefly. In our model, we assume 20 years for that. So we are assuming that they do need to be replaced, but so does a gas boiler, and they are paying back within about 7 years as well, or even less depending on the year. So even with that 20-year lifetime, they still seem to be making sense for consumers.
Okay, Terence, did you have a thought on that?
No, it's pretty much I suppose the same as what Lisa was saying. Although, I mean, I will just sort of add my own calculations that I did because I was personally looking at installing a battery system in my house recently, and I would have found that with the current cost of batteries and the you know, and there isn't and many of the price schemes. So the advantage of the battery is, of course, that you could offset your peak electricity demand, and so the greater the disparity between, say, the peak electricity demand and, say, night electricity demand, the more profitable your battery will become. But with the way those prices are at the moment, you know, I still think the domestic batteries aren't sort of they're not you know, there isn't a great economic incentive to actually install them. That's why I think personally that something like you know, vehicle to grid or vehicle to home technology has a great role to play there, because if you have an electric vehicle, you have a large battery. You may have a large battery anyway. And so that's a kind of an added incentive perhaps for people also to, you know, to go down the road of having an electric vehicle if that sort of technology comes into play.
Kind of a win-win. Exactly.
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Another question. Do we have an estimate for how much hydrogen we might need to produce annually to balance the energy system in a future 100% renewable energy scenario? Charlene, that sounds like one for you.
Yeah. So I don't have a number off the top of my head, but I can just speak to the factors that play into this. So currently our electricity system can handle about 75% renewables, like at a single point. But then, of course, with the variability in renewable supply, we take about 40%. 30 to 40%, let's say. And the rest of that is mostly covered by gas. And of course, our hope is that, first of all, we can increase the amount of renewable electricities to close to 100%, but whatever cannot be covered by that, both in terms of instantaneous and overall, should be covered by gas. And in our case, we hope it would be hydrogen and green hydrogen. So when we have a lot of electricity that is being produced by the renewables, and at that moment there's not a lot of demand, we can then convert this to hydrogen, but of course there's losses when we do this. So that means that let's say it takes around 50 kilowatt hours of electricity to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen. That hydrogen contains around 30 kilowatt hours of energy content. And then when you combust that hydrogen to produce electricity again, you are then losing some again. So whatever amount in terms of the actual energy content that we need for balancing, it's going to be more because we don't have a perfect perfectly efficient system.
Yeah, very good. Thanks for that. Okay, we have a question about data centers. Are we looking at a scenario where we accept the role of being the data center headquarters for Europe and develop a strategy and approach for supporting data center expansion to support AI applications within Ireland? So obviously data centers they use enormous amounts of energy. Panel's got thoughts on that?
Well, okay. So I mean, are we going to be looking at those scenarios within our modeling? Yes, absolutely. Are we going to be looking at a scenario where we have sort of a you know, large expansion of data centers, and you know, the predictions are, some predictions by EirGrid are that they could be requiring up to 30% of the electrical demand by, I think, 2030. I guess in general in data centers, I mean, let's face it, data centers are here, they're a thing, and unless we're all going to stop watching Netflix and stop doing our social media thing, they're here to stay, right? They're a part of it. They're a part of the system. And of course, they're only set to become even a greater part of the system with the sort of AI applications that are coming around. So the data centers are here. They're going to have to go somewhere. And so from a global perspective, it kind of makes sense that they go somewhere where there is going to be a big focus on making the energy 100% renewable energy. So that's one way of looking at it. I think, I mean, I personally think that the important thing there is to sort of try to ensure that data centers are more sustainable in the way in which they run, and make better use of renewables, and perhaps are even more flexible in the way they run, so as to help out with that flexibility associated with the grid.
Yeah. Great, thank you. But you'll be looking at those scenarios. That's great.
Yes.
Question on flexibility. We're nearly out of time, but we have time for a couple more questions. Question on flexibility. Do we know when networks will achieve flexibility saturation and market saturation? There's a risk that a full focus on flexibility will cause the flexible market model to collapse within itself. I'm so sorry. I'm not having a good day on this one. I'm just going to mute myself.
That's a question for Terence, is it?
Yeah, I'll try to answer that one. So the question is, do we know when? I would say no, not quite yet. We don't know exactly when. However, it is certainly an observation I think that we would have seen from the modeling, and again I'll refer back to some modeling, Lisa, that you would have done on sort of the impact of flexibility in terms of being able to absorb more renewables, and what you definitely see is a saturating effect. In other words, you can only shift around so much energy by so much within certain things, like be it EVs or heat pumps or whatever. So there will be a saturating effect, I think. And of course the other issue is that to incentivize people. So if you're looking at flexibility from the demand side, and you want people to sort of, perhaps give over the use of their EV battery for flexibility, then I think there would have to be an incentive there. So there would have to be, people have to be remunerated in some manner. I think probably that remuneration, starting out, that remuneration could be, perhaps quite high for people, and could provide an incentive. But if more and more people are doing that, and we have more and more people with EVs, I would imagine that sort of might rapidly become a costly method of doing things, and so there will be a kind of I would imagine in the long term a kind of a tuning back of the I suppose the value of that in a system. But I'd say all I can say is, yes, we observed that there would be a saturation effect. There's from flexibility, and I think it is an interesting question that we can look at, is when or that might happen at what point in the system.
Great, thank you, Terence. And I apologize, my phone is on silent, but unfortunately my computer decides to make noise when my phone rings. So we do have a few more questions, but we are just running out of time. So I'm very sorry that we haven't been able to get to all the questions, but it's a sign of an engaged audience that asks that many. So well done. I might ask our panelists just to give us a one-liner in case any people seeking public representation knock on our doors. What should we be asking them about? Lisa, what's the most important thing we should be asking public representatives about?
I think I suppose implementing measures that will actually achieve targets. I don't think we need to be designing new targets. We need to really focus on getting the ones that we have set in place to achieve those. And a lot of that is about making sure that infrastructure is put in on time, and put through the planning process, and just making sure that that new planning bill is actually implemented, so that all the different climate action measures that are stalled can start being implemented.
Great, thank you. Conor?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the focus of NexSys is net zero carbon, and of course carbon is an issue because of climate change, and so I think really I plan on asking everybody who knocks on my door about concrete actions regarding climate change, because that's the context within which really we're working.
Great, thank you. Charlene?
I think more public engagement actually is absolutely crucial. We have so many different pathways, but we don't know which one is the correct one because we don't know what people want. So not only in that direction, but also we hope to help people understand these different systems as well. So yeah, engagement.
Great, thank you. Terence, is Terence still? I don't see his. Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much to our panelists, and congratulations as well, NexSys, on a really excellent document, a roadmap. Look forward to future chapters. But for now, Terence, Lisa, Charlene and Conor, thank you so much for joining us today. And Anthea and Maria, thanks for getting everything going. And Anthea, thanks for doing all the slides as well. And thank you for being such an engaged audience. I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but we're just out of time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.